Sometimes grief makes us do things that look crazy to everyone else. When Ray Moreno spent his daughter's college fund on a crumbling airport, his whole town turned against him. The local news called him a fool. His neighbors whispered behind his back. But Ray couldn't shake the feeling that his late wife was trying to tell him something through his dreams. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Main Street in Kendall Falls, Nevada, a town that had forgotten how to dream. Ray Moreno stood outside the county courthouse, wiping sweat from his hands with a rag that had seen too many years of honest work. At 45, he carried himself like a man who had learned that life could break you in ways you never expected, but that you kept going anyway because giving up wasn't an option when you had people counting on you. The courthouse steps were crowded with the usual suspects at government auctions, real estate speculators in cheap suits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Local contractors looking for equipment deals, and a handful of curious townspeople with nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. Ray had come here for one reason. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick had finally given up completely, and he needed the money from selling her trade-in to keep his auto shop's lights on another month. Lot 47, the auctioneer's voice crackled through a portable speaker system that had seen better decades. Abandoned airfield property, 150 acres, structures included, opening bid set at $500. Ray glanced up from his auction catalog. He'd driven past that old airstrip hundreds of times on the way to pick up parts in Vegas. Nothing out there but sand, sagebrush, and a couple of weathered hangars that looked ready to collapse. The place had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Probably some leftover from World War II or the Cold War, like half the forgotten installations scattered across the Nevada desert. Do I hear 500? The auctioneer squinted at the sparse crowd. Anyone? Folks, this is 150 acres of prime desert real estate. Prime was generous. Ray had seen the property. It was 20 miles from nowhere, connected to town by a dirt road that turned to soup when it rained and concrete when it didn't. No water rights, no power lines, no cell towers within range, just emptiness under a sky so big it made a man feel insignificant. But something about the place had always struck him as familiar, though he'd never been inside the perimeter fence. Maybe it was the way the mountains framed it, or how the hangars caught the light at sunset. Lena had always said he was too sentimental for his own good, seeing meaning in things that were just coincidence. $200, someone called out. Ray turned to see Jimmy Valdez, who owned the scrapyard outside town. Jimmy was always looking for metal to salvage. 200, thank you. Do I hear 300? Ray found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Sophie that morning. His 16-year-old daughter had been distant since Lena's death 2 years ago, throwing herself into schoolwork and college prep with the kind of single-minded intensity that reminded him of her mother. This morning, she'd asked about her college fund again, specifically how much was left after all the medical bills. The honest answer was not enough. Even with the life insurance payout, cancer treatment had eaten through their savings like acid. The auto shop was barely breaking even, and competition from the chain stores in Vegas was getting worse every year. Sophie was smart enough for any college in the country, but smart didn't pay tuition. 300, do I hear 400? Ray's hand moved before his brain caught up to what he was doing. 500, he heard himself say. Heads turned. He recognized most of the faces, people he'd known for years, whose cars he'd fixed, whose kids had played with Sophie when she was younger. Their expressions ranged from surprised to pitying. Ray Moreno, making another bad decision. Ray Moreno, still not right since his wife died. 500 from the gentleman in the work shirt. Do I hear 6? Jimmy Valdez was staring at him now, probably wondering if Ray knew something he didn't. The scrap dealer's eyes narrowed as he calculated whether the metal in those hangars was worth more than $500. 600, Jimmy called. Ray should have stopped. He should have thanked whatever impulse had gotten him this far and walked away. The smart play was to go back to his shop, fix Mrs. Patterson's carburetor, and figure out how to scrape together another month's rent. But something was pulling at him, the same feeling he'd been having in his dreams lately. Dreams where Lena stood in a hangar, pointing at something just out of sight, her lips moving but no sound coming out. $1,000. The words came out louder than he'd intended. A few people turned to stare. Ray could feel his face heating up, but he kept his hand raised. Somewhere behind him, he heard Mayor Jocelyn Briggs mutter something to her assistant about poor man finally losing it completely. $1,000, the auctioneer repeated, sounding more awake now. Do I hear 1,100? The silence stretched on. Jimmy Valdez shook his head and turned away. Nobody else was crazy enough to bid on a property that would cost more to insure than it would ever be worth. Going once at $1,000, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air like a sword. Sold to bidder number 23 for $1,000. Ray's knees felt weak. He'd just spent Sophie's college fund on 150 acres of worthless desert and a couple of buildings that were probably full of asbestos and rattlesnakes. The smart money in town would be talking about this for months. Ray Moreno, the mechanic who finally cracked up completely. But as he walked to the clerk's table to fill out the paperwork, something else was stirring in his chest. For the first time since Lena's funeral, he felt like he'd done something instead of just reacting to things being done to him. It might have been stupid, but it was his kind of stupid. The drive home took 20 minutes, plenty of time to imagine Sophie's reaction. She was waiting for him on the front porch of their small ranch house, still in her school clothes. Her dark hair pulled back the same way Lena used to wear it when she was concentrating on something important. At 16, Sophie had inherited her mother's analytical mind and her father's stubborn streak, though Ray suspected she'd gotten a double dose of the latter. "Dad?" Sophie stood up as he pulled into the driveway. "You were supposed to be back an hour ago. I've got AP Physics homework and you promised to help with the car problem sets." Ray turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Through the windshield, he could see his daughter waiting, arms crossed, wearing the expression that meant she was trying to decide whether to be worried or annoyed. "Sophie," he said finally, "we need to talk." Sophie's reaction was about what Ray had expected, which was to say it involved a lot of door slamming and some words he pretended not to hear through the thin walls of their house. By the time she emerged from her room 3 hours later, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the property deed spread out next to a pile of county records he'd pulled from the courthouse basement. "An airport," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Her anger had cooled into something sharper. Disappointment mixed with the kind of analytical precision she'd inherited from her mother. "You bought an abandoned airport with my college money." "It's an investment," Ray said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "It's 150 acres of nothing, 20 miles from town, with buildings that probably haven't been inspected since the Carter administration." Sophie picked up one of the survey maps. "Dad, what were you thinking?" Ray studied his daughter's face, looking for traces of Lena in the set of her jaw and the way she tilted her head when she was working through a problem. Sometimes the resemblance was so strong it took his breath away. "I was thinking about your mother," he said finally. Sophie's expression softened slightly. "Mom never mentioned any airport. She used to talk about flying sometimes. When we were dating, she'd point out different aircraft when they passed overhead. Said she wanted to learn to pilot someday." Ray touched the deed with one finger. "Maybe this is crazy, but I keep having these dreams where she's trying to tell me something. And when I saw this place today, it felt like what?" "Familiar." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, studying the maps and documents. Ray had learned not to interrupt when she was processing information. It was one of her mother's traits, the need to examine a problem from all angles before committing to a response. "Okay," she said finally, "it's done. We can't afford to keep it, but maybe we can flip it to someone who actually wants 150 acres of desert." She looked up at him. "But first, I want to see what you bought." They drove out to the property the next morning, taking the old dirt road that branched off Highway 95, about 15 miles south of town. Ray's pickup truck bounced and rattled over washboard ruts that hadn't been maintained in decades, kicking up clouds of dust that coated everything in fine grit. Rusty, their 3-year-old mutt, stood in the truck bed with his nose into the wind, ears flapping. They'd adopted him shortly after Lena's funeral, a gesture toward normalcy that had gradually become one of the few bright spots in their lives. The dog was some kind of shepherd mix, intelligent and protective, with the kind of personality that made you think he understood more than he let on. The airfield appeared gradually through the heat shimmer, starting with a chain-link fence that ran along the road and eventually revealing two large hangars and what looked like the remnants of a control tower. Everything was painted in shades of sand and rust, as if the desert was slowly reclaiming what had once been carved out of it. Ray parked next to a gate that hung open on broken hinges. According to the county records, the last official activity here had been in 1987, when the property was transferred from federal to county jurisdiction. Before that, the paper trail got murky. References to strategic installations and classified operations that had been redacted or lost in bureaucratic shuffles. "It's bigger than I expected," Sophie said, climbing out of the truck. She was right. The main runway stretched for what looked like half a mile, wide enough for serious aircraft. Not the kind of strip you'd build for crop dusters or weekend pilots. This was military-grade infrastructure, though time and weather had taken their toll. Cracks ran through the asphalt like lightning, filled with hardy desert weeds that had found purchase in the smallest gaps. Rusty jumped down from the truck bed and immediately started investigating the perimeter, nose to the ground, following scent trails only he could detect. Ray had learned to pay attention to the dog's instincts. Rusty had a talent for sensing things that weren't obvious to human perception. The first hangar was enormous, big enough for multiple aircraft, with sliding doors that had been welded shut years ago. Sophie walked the length of it, examining the construction with the eye of someone who'd grown up around mechanical systems. "Dad, look at this!" she called from the far end. Ray joined her at what appeared to be a standard electrical junction box mounted on the hangar's exterior wall. But Sophie had pried it open to reveal something more sophisticated than basic wiring. "This isn't power distribution," she said, pointing to a series of cables that disappeared into the building's foundation. "It's communications equipment. Military grade, from the look of it. And it's been maintained more recently than anything else out here." Before Ray could respond, Rusty started barking from somewhere behind the second hangar. Not his usual alert bark, but something more urgent. Something that meant he'd found something unusual. They followed the sound to the back of the smaller building, where Rusty was digging frantically at what looked like ordinary desert floor. But as they got closer, Ray realized the dog was scratching at something metallic buried just beneath the surface. "Rusty, heel," Sophie commanded, and the dog reluctantly stepped back. Ray knelt and brushed away sand and debris, revealing what appeared to be a circular metal plate about 3 feet in diameter. It was flush with the ground, nearly invisible, unless you knew where to look. The surface was marked with a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him, but Sophie was already pulling out her phone to take pictures. "Dad, this looks like some kind of access hatch." Ray ran his fingers around the edge, feeling for a handle or release mechanism. The metal was heavier than steel, some kind of composite designed to resist corrosion and detection. After a few minutes of searching, he found a small depression that might have been a keyhole, though it was unlike any lock he'd ever seen. "We need tools," he said, standing up and dusting off his knees. They drove back to town for bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a flashlight powerful enough to illuminate whatever lay beneath. Ray also stopped at the hardware store for work gloves and a first aid kit, though he couldn't have explained why he felt they might need medical supplies. By the time they returned to the airfield, the sun was starting to set, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. The temperature was dropping toward the pleasant range, and the evening wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. It took nearly an hour to cut through the locking mechanism. Whatever this hatch was designed to protect, someone had taken security seriously. But eventually the cover lifted on hinges that were still smooth and well-maintained despite decades of burial. Ray shone his flashlight into the opening and found himself looking at a metal ladder that descended into darkness. The walls were lined with what appeared to be the same composite material as the hatch, and the air that drifted up from below was cool and dry, artificially conditioned, as if some kind of life support system was still functioning. "Sophie," he said, "maybe we should call someone about this." But his daughter was already swinging one leg over the edge. "Call who, Dad? And tell them what? That we found a hole in the ground on our own property?" She had a point. And besides, Ray was curious too. More than curious, he was driven by the same impulse that had made him bid on this place in the first place. The feeling that Lena was somehow involved in whatever they'd stumbled onto. The ladder descended about 20 feet before ending in what appeared to be a corridor carved out of solid rock. Their flashlights revealed smooth walls, a concrete floor, and doorways leading in multiple directions. The air was stale but breathable, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the hum of machinery still running after all these years. "Dad," Sophie whispered, grabbing his arm, "look at this." She was pointing at a placard mounted on the wall next to what looked like the main entrance. Most of the text had been obscured by official stamps and redaction marks. But two things were clearly visible: a date from 1986, and at the bottom, a signature that made Ray's blood run cold. Dr. Helena M. Hawthorne. Lena's maiden name, in handwriting he recognized as clearly as his own. The underground corridor stretched further than their flashlights could reach, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Ray stood frozen at the base of the ladder, staring at his wife's signature on a document that wasn't supposed to exist, in a place that wasn't supposed to be here. "Dad," Sophie whispered, her voice echoing off the smooth walls. "Mom worked on classified projects sometimes, right? Defense contracts?" Ray nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. Lena had been an aerospace engineer before Sophie was born, brilliant enough to work on projects she could never talk about. After Sophie came along, she'd taken a position with a civilian firm in Vegas. Less money, but regular hours, and no security clearances to maintain. At least, that's what Ray had always believed. She always said the military work was boring, he managed finally. Just theoretical stuff. Paper studies that never went anywhere. Sophie was examining the placard more closely, taking photos with her phone's flashlight. "This doesn't look theoretical, Dad. Look at the stamp at the bottom." Ray leaned in to see what she was pointing at. Beneath Lena's signature was an official seal he didn't recognize, surrounding words that made his chest tighten. "Project Nightshade, authorized personnel only." "We should go back," he said, though even as he spoke he was moving deeper into the corridor. "Figure out who to call about this." "Call who?" Sophie fell into step beside him, her footsteps eerily quiet in the artificial space. "Dad, if Mom was involved in whatever this place is, maybe we're supposed to be here. Maybe that's why you felt drawn to buy it." The corridor branched in three directions. Ray chose the path that felt most like it led toward the hangars above, following his mechanic's instinct for how buildings were laid out. The walls here were lined with what looked like technical diagrams behind thick plexiglass, though most of the content had been blacked out with heavy markers. But Sophie had stopped at one of the displays, pressing her face close to the glass. "Dad, come look at this." The diagram she'd found was different from the others. Instead of heavy redaction marks, this one had been covered with what appeared to be correction fluid that had yellowed and cracked over time. Underneath, barely visible, were the faint outlines of an aircraft design unlike anything Ray had ever seen. "It's a stealth fighter," Sophie said, her voice filled with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for physics problems. "Look at the wing configuration. And these angles, everything's designed to scatter radar signals." Ray studied the faded lines. He knew enough about aircraft from his years as an aviation mechanic to recognize sophisticated engineering when he saw it. This wasn't some experimental prototype sketched on a napkin. This was a fully developed design, complete with specifications for materials, propulsion systems, and avionics. The F-117 wasn't publicly acknowledged until 1988, Sophie continued, photographing the diagram from multiple angles. But this design is different, more advanced, like it's a generation ahead of anything that was supposed to exist in the 80s. They followed the corridor deeper, past more displays and several doors marked with warnings in multiple languages. The hum of machinery was getting stronger, suggesting that whatever power source fed this place was still operational after decades of abandonment. The corridor ended at a set of heavy double doors marked with the same Project Nightshade seal they'd seen at the entrance. Ray pushed against them, expecting resistance, but they swung open smoothly on well-maintained hinges. The space beyond was vast, a hangar carved out of living rock, easily the size of the buildings above ground. But where the surface hangars were empty except for sand and bird nests, this underground facility contained something that made Ray forget to breathe. The aircraft was covered with tarps that had been secured with military precision, but its outline was unmistakable, sleek, angular, with the kind of aggressive beauty that spoke of serious engineering and unlimited budgets. This wasn't a display model or a mock-up. This was the real thing, a fully functional stealth fighter that had been hidden beneath the Nevada desert for over 30 years. "Jesus," Ray whispered. Sophie was already moving toward the aircraft, her natural curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "Dad, there's a workstation over here, with Mom's name on it." Ray joined her at a desk that looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of a normal workday. Coffee cup, still sitting next to a computer terminal. Technical manuals, open to specific pages. And pinned to a corkboard above the monitor, a family photo that Ray recognized, himself and Sophie at a county fair, taken just months before Lena's death. But it was the document spread across the desk that really caught his attention. A technical manual bound in red covers, marked top secret in bold letters across every page. The title page read, F-121 Nightshade Operational Procedures, and underneath, in smaller print, Dr. Helena M. Hawthorne, Lead Systems Engineer. "She wasn't just involved, Dad," Sophie said, flipping through pages covered with Lena's handwriting. "She designed this thing." Ray sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the implications. His wife, the woman who'd made him pancakes every Sunday morning, who taught Sophie to ride a bicycle, who died in what everyone said was a random industrial accident, had been the lead engineer on what appeared to be one of the most advanced military aircraft ever built. And now it was sitting in a hangar he owned, on property he'd bought with his daughter's college fund, in a moment of grief-driven impulse that suddenly seemed a lot less random. "Dad, look at this," Sophie called from the other side of the aircraft. She was standing next to a smaller workstation equipped with what looked like communications equipment. Multiple radios, computer terminals, and a large map of the southwestern United States marked with locations that meant nothing to Ray but seemed to excite Sophie. "These are test flight coordinates," she said, tracing routes with her finger. "And look at the dates. The last entry was made just 3 days before Mom's accident." Ray joined her at the map, studying the dates and locations. According to Lena's notes, the F-121 had been conducting regular test flights from this facility right up until her death. But if that was true, where was the flight crew? Where was the ground support team? Where was everyone who would have been needed to operate a program like this? "There's more," Sophie said, opening a filing cabinet that had been secured with a lock that looked like it had been cut recently. "Dad, I think someone else has been down here, recently." The cabinet was full of documents that appeared to have been hastily sorted through. File folders pulled out and replaced in the wrong order. Papers that looked like they'd been photocopied before being returned. And at the bottom of the stack, a business card that made Ray's blood run cold. Elliot Grange, CEO, Solaris Systems. On the back, someone had written a date from just 2 weeks ago and the words, "Recovery authorization pending." Ray pocketed the card, his mind racing. Someone knew about this place. Someone with connections and resources was already making plans for the aircraft. And somehow, his impulsive purchase of the airfield had put him and Sophie directly in their path. "We need to get out of here," he said, but Sophie was already at another workstation, this one equipped with what looked like video monitoring equipment. "Dad, there are cameras everywhere, above ground and down here, and they're still recording." She pointed to a bank of monitors showing feeds from around the property. "Someone's been watching this place." As if summoned by her words, one of the monitors flashed with the image of a black SUV pulling up to the airfield's main gate. Ray watched as 3 men in dark suits climbed out and began walking toward the hangar where they'd first discovered the hidden entrance. "They know we're here," he said, grabbing Sophie's hand. "We need to go, now." But as they headed for the corridor that led back to the surface, Rusty's barking echoed down from above. Not his usual alert bark, but the urgent, aggressive sound he made when he sensed real danger, the kind of danger that meant someone was threatening his family. Ray looked at his daughter, seeing Lena's determined expression in her eyes. "Sophie, whatever happens up there, stay close to me. And if I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just get to town and find Sheriff Martinez." Sophie nodded, but Ray could see she was scared now. The excitement of discovery had given way to the realization that they'd stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than an abandoned airport. As they climbed the ladder toward the surface, Ray found himself thinking about Lena's signature on that document, about the family photo on her workstation, about test flights that had continued right up until her death. Maybe Lena's accident hadn't been random after all. Maybe she'd been silenced because she'd known too much about Project Nightshade and the aircraft hidden beneath the Nevada desert. And maybe, just maybe, her husband and daughter were about to find out exactly how far some people would go to keep those secrets buried. The evening air hit them like a wall as they emerged from the underground facility. Rusty was still barking, but now Ray could see why. The three men from the SUV were standing near his pickup truck, and one of them was talking on a satellite phone while examining the license plate. Ray pulled the hatch closed and kicked sand over it, though he knew it was probably too late to hide what they'd discovered. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the simple life of fixing cars and pretending the past was safely buried. The truth about Lena's death was down in that underground hangar, along with a stealth fighter worth more money than Ray could imagine. But as he watched the men in suits walking toward them with purposeful strides, he realized the aircraft might not be the most valuable thing he'd inherited. The real treasure might be the chance to finally learn what had happened to his wife, and what some people had been willing to kill to keep secret. The woman who knocked on Ray's door the next morning didn't look like the kind of federal agent you see in movies. Agent Nadine Kessler was maybe 40, dressed in a practical gray suit that had seen actual use, with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd learned to read people for a living. She showed her credentials through the screen door, Department of Defense, Office of Special Investigations, and waited patiently while Ray decided whether to let her in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mr. Moreno, I understand you recently purchased some property out on the old airfield road. I'd like to discuss that with you. Ray opened the door but didn't invite her inside. Sophie was at school, and he wanted to keep it that way. Whatever this conversation was about, his daughter didn't need to be part of it until he understood what they were dealing with. It's public record, he said. Bought it at a county auction, fair and square. Kessler smiled, the kind of expression that was meant to be reassuring but didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course. The purchase itself isn't the issue, Mr. Moreno. It's what might be on that property that concerns my department. Which is? That's what I'd like to find out. Would you mind if I took a look around? Just a quick inspection to make sure there are no complications. Ray studied her face, looking for tells the way he'd learned to read engines that weren't running quite right. Agent Kessler was professional, polite, and absolutely determined to get onto his property. But there was something else underneath the official manner, a kind of uncertainty that suggested she didn't know exactly what she was looking for either. Property's posted, Ray said finally. Insurance liability. I'm having the structures inspected before I let anyone else out there. It was a reasonable excuse, and they both knew it. Kessler nodded as if she'd expected as much. I understand your caution, Mr. Moreno, but I should mention that if there are any federal assets on that property, equipment, materials, anything that might have been left behind from previous operations, possession of those items without proper authorization could be considered a federal crime. The threat was delivered in the same pleasant tone she'd used to introduce herself, but Ray felt it land like a punch to the stomach. Federal crime meant serious prison time. It meant losing the shop, the house, everything he'd worked for. It meant Sophie growing up without either parent. I wouldn't know a federal asset from a hole in the ground, Ray said, which was technically true, but if I find anything that doesn't belong to me, I'll be sure to call you. Kessler handed him a business card with just her name and a phone number. No agency logo, no official seals, the kind of card someone carries when their real job can't be advertised. Mr. Moreno, let me be direct. There are people in Washington who would prefer that certain aspects of that property's history remain undisturbed. If you cooperate with my investigation, I can make sure any complications are handled quietly and professionally. And if I don't cooperate, then other people get involved, people who are less interested in quiet and professional. Ray watched her walk back to her government sedan, noting the way she took a long look at his auto shop before driving away. The message was clear enough. They knew where he lived, where he worked, and probably a lot more about his life than he was comfortable with. He was still standing in his doorway when Hank Dalton's pickup truck pulled into the driveway. The old Vietnam vet climbed out slowly, favoring the left leg that had been giving him trouble since his tour in Southeast Asia. Hank was one of the few people in town who'd never looked at Ray with pity after Lena's death, probably because he understood what it meant to lose people who mattered. Saw the Fed leaving, Hank said without preamble. Figured you might want to know what I know about that place you bought. Ray invited him inside, grateful for someone who didn't dance around the point. Hank had been a military mechanic before the war and a civilian aircraft mechanic after it. If anyone in Kendall Falls understood the aviation business, it was him. Coffee? Ray offered, but Hank was already settling into a kitchen chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints kept their own schedule. That airfield wasn't abandoned when they say it was, Hank began. I used to do contract work for the government, maintaining aircraft at various facilities around Nevada. Saw flights going in and out of your place as recently as 1987, maybe 1988. What kind of flights? The kind you don't ask questions about. Black aircraft, usually at night, no identification markings, always escorted by fighters from Nellis. Hank's weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug Ray set in front of him. Your wife knew about those flights. Ray sat down hard. What? Lena came to see me about 6 months before she died. Said she was working on a project that was making her uncomfortable. Something about aircraft that were supposed to be decommissioned but weren't. She wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual at the old facilities around here. What did you tell her? Same thing I'm telling you. That place has been active long after the official records say it was shut down. And the people running those operations don't like questions. Ray thought about the business card in his pocket, about Agent Kessler's polite threats, about the underground hangar full of secrets his wife had died protecting. Hank, what do you think happened to Lena? The old mechanic was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. I think she found something she wasn't supposed to find. And I think the people responsible are still around, still protecting whatever she discovered. He looked up at Ray. Which means you and Sophie might be in the same kind of trouble she was. That afternoon, Ray drove out to the airfield alone, leaving Rusty at home and telling Sophie he was checking on the property boundaries. He needed time to think, to process what Agent Kessler and Hank Dalton had told him. But mostly, he needed to see that underground hangar again, to make sure he hadn't imagined the aircraft that bore his wife's signature. The hatch was exactly where they'd left it, though Ray noticed fresh tire tracks near the second hangar that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone else had been poking around the property, probably while he was talking to Kessler. The underground facility felt different in daylight, less mysterious, more clinical. The fluorescent lights that had flickered on automatically yesterday revealed details he'd missed in the excitement of discovery. This wasn't some hastily built bunker or repurposed storage facility. This was a sophisticated installation designed for long-term operations, complete with its own power generation, air filtration, and communication systems. Ray made his way to Lena's workstation, hoping to find some explanation for why his wife's personal effects were scattered across a desk in a facility that wasn't supposed to exist. The computer terminal was still active, displaying a login screen that prompted for both a username and a biometric scan. But it was the desk drawer that yielded the real treasure. Hidden beneath a stack of technical manuals was a small digital recorder, the kind Lena had used for dictating notes when she worked late into the night. Ray pressed the play button, and his wife's voice filled the underground hangar for the first time in 2 years. Personal log, September 15, 1987. Helena Moreno recording. Her voice sounded tired, strained in a way Ray remembered from the final months of her illness. The test flights are producing data that contradicts everything we thought we knew about the stealth characteristics. The radar signature is too clean, the maneuverability too advanced. We're not just ahead of schedule, we're ahead of possibility. Ray sank into her chair, listening to his wife's voice describe technical challenges that were clearly beyond his understanding. But her tone was what caught his attention. Lena sounded scared. Elliot wants to move the project to private oversight. Says the military bureaucracy is slowing us down, that Solaris Systems can provide better funding and fewer restrictions. But I've seen the contracts. This isn't about research anymore. They want to reverse engineer the propulsion system and sell it to the highest bidder. The recording crackled with static for a moment before Lena's voice returned, more urgent now. I can't let that happen. This technology, if it falls into the wrong hands, Ray, if something happens to me, if there's an accident, or if I disappear, you need to know that I didn't walk away from my family by choice. I'm trying to protect what we built, what we discovered. The aircraft is hidden where only you would think to look. Find it, expose what they're doing. Don't let them turn this into a weapon for profit. The recording ended with the soft click of the device being turned off. Ray sat in the underground silence, holding the recorder that contained his wife's final message, a message intended for him, recorded in a place he'd found through what seemed like impossible coincidence. But maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe Lena had known that grief and intuition would eventually lead him here, to the truth she'd died protecting. Ray pocketed the recorder and headed for the ladder that led back to the surface. He had a daughter to protect and a mystery to solve, but first he needed to understand exactly what his wife had died trying to prevent. As he climbed toward daylight, Ray made a decision that would change everything. He was done running from the truth. It was time to start fighting back. Elliot Grange arrived in Kendall Falls like a desert storm, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. His motorcade pulled up to Ray's auto shop on a Thursday morning when the temperature was already climbing toward triple digits, and the town was moving at the sluggish pace that came with serious heat. Ray was underneath Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick when the shadow of expensive shoes appeared at the edge of his vision. He rolled out from under the car to find a man in his 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Ray made in a month, standing in the middle of the garage like he owned the place. "Mr. Moreno," the stranger said, extending a manicured hand. "Elliot Grange, Solaris Systems. I believe we have some business to discuss." Ray didn't take the offered hand. He'd heard that name before, on Lena's recording, spoken with the kind of fear usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. This was the man his wife had been trying to stop, the one who'd wanted to turn classified military technology into private profit. "Don't recall making any appointments," Ray said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Grange smiled, the practiced expression of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm and barely concealed threat. "No appointment necessary for what I'm offering. I understand you recently acquired some property that might be of interest to my company." "Property's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Mr. Moreno. It's just a matter of price." Grange pulled out his phone and showed Ray a number that made him blink twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. $10 million. Cash. All you have to do is sign the deed over to Solaris Systems and forget you ever owned 150 acres of desert. $10 million. Enough to send Sophie to any college in the world, enough to buy a new house, a new shop, a completely new life anywhere they wanted to start over. All he had to do was walk away from a piece of worthless land that was bringing nothing but trouble into his life. "Why?" Ray asked. "What's so valuable about a bunch of empty hangars?" "That's not your concern," Grange said, putting his phone away. "What should concern you is that this is a very generous offer for property that could become problematic for a civilian to own." There was the threat, delivered with the same polished professionalism Agent Kessler had used, but where Kessler had seemed genuinely conflicted about her role, Grange radiated the confidence of someone who'd made similar offers before and knew exactly how they usually ended. "I'll think about it," Ray said. "Of course, take your time, but don't take too much time." Grange handed him a business card, identical to the one Ray had found in the underground filing cabinet. Market conditions can change quickly in this business. After Grange left, Ray stood in his garage feeling like he'd just been visited by something poisonous. The man's offer was real. $10 million was more money than Ray had ever imagined having. But accepting it would mean abandoning Lena's final request, walking away from the truth she'd died trying to protect. He was still wrestling with the decision when Sophie burst through the garage door, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her laptop tucked under the other arm. "Dad, we have a problem," she announced, setting up her computer on his workbench. "I've been researching Solaris Systems, and you need to see what I found." Ray looked over her shoulder as she pulled up a series of websites and documents. Solaris Systems was a private defense contractor specializing in advanced aerospace technologies and strategic asset recovery. Translation: they found ways to turn classified military research into commercial products. "Look at this," Sophie said, clicking on a news article from 1987. Solaris was awarded a contract to evaluate and disposition surplus military aircraft from decommissioned test programs. That's corporate speak for stripping classified technology and selling it. Ray studied the article, noting the date, just 2 months before Lena's death. "There's more," Sophie continued, opening another browser tab. "I found records of Solaris employees who died in industrial accidents between 1987 and 1990. 7 people, all engineers or technicians who'd worked on classified projects, all ruled accidental deaths. Ray felt cold, despite the desert heat. "Sophie, where did you find this information?" "Mom's files," she said quietly, "the ones from the underground facility. I copied everything to my laptop yesterday while you were talking to that federal agent. Dad, Mom wasn't just investigating the stealth program. She was documenting a pattern of murder." Ray sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. His wife hadn't just stumbled onto some bureaucratic cover-up. She'd uncovered evidence of systematic assassination, people killed to protect corporate profits. "There's something else," Sophie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I found surveillance photos of our house. Pictures of you, me, Mom. They were taken just days before her accident." She showed him a series of images that made his blood freeze. Photos of Lena leaving for work, of Sophie waiting for the school bus, of Ray working in his garage. Someone had been watching his family, documenting their routines, learning their patterns. "Dad, what if Mom's accident wasn't an accident at all?" Ray looked at his daughter. Brilliant, brave, too young to be dealing with the possibility that her mother had been murdered. But the evidence was mounting, and ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. "We need help," he said finally. "This is bigger than we can handle alone." But before Sophie could respond, both their phones buzzed with incoming text messages. The same message on both devices. "Accept the offer. You have 48 hours." Ray deleted the text and helped Sophie pack up her laptop. Someone was watching them, someone with the resources to track their phone numbers and the confidence to make threats in broad daylight. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ray sat on his front porch with Rusty at his feet, thinking about Lena's voice on that digital recorder. She'd known the risks when she recorded that message, known that investigating Solaris systems could get her killed, but she'd done it anyway because some truths were worth dying for. The question now was whether Ray had the courage to finish what she'd started. As if summoned by his thoughts, a black SUV drove slowly past his house, its tinted windows revealing nothing about the occupants. It was the same vehicle he'd seen at the airfield, the same type that had been following him since his meeting with Agent Kessler. Ray pulled out his phone and called the number on Kessler's card. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Moreno, I was wondering when you'd call." "We need to meet," Ray said. "Somewhere safe. I have information you need to hear." There was a pause, then Kessler's voice, more human than it had sounded during their first encounter. "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., Rosie's Diner on Highway 95. Come alone." Ray hung up and went inside to check the locks on his doors and windows. Tomorrow he'd start the process of bringing down the people who'd killed his wife. Tonight, he just wanted to make sure he and Sophie lived long enough to see morning. Rusty found the second entrance while Ray was meeting with Agent Kessler at the diner. Sophie had stayed home from school with what she diplomatically called stomach problems, and Ray had left the dog to keep her company while he tried to figure out whether Kessler could be trusted with the truth about what they'd discovered. The meeting hadn't gone well. Kessler was sympathetic but limited by bureaucracy and chain of command. She believed Ray's story about Lena's suspicious death, but proving it would require evidence that could expose classified operations and embarrass powerful people, the kind of evidence that tended to disappear before it could reach a courtroom. "Give me something concrete," Kessler had said as they parted ways. "Documents, recordings, physical proof, something I can use to build a case that won't get buried by people with more authority than I have." Ray was still thinking about that conversation when Sophie called his cell phone, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "Dad, you need to get out here. Rusty found something, and it's big." By the time Ray reached the airfield, Sophie had already pried open what appeared to be a second access hatch, this one hidden beneath the collapsed wall of the smaller hangar. Rusty sat nearby, looking pleased with himself in the way dogs do when they've solved a puzzle their humans couldn't figure out. "It's a whole different facility," Sophie explained as they descended another ladder into another underground chamber, connected to the main hangar but older, like it was built first and then expanded. This section felt different from the sterile military precision of the main facility. The walls were rougher, carved from native rock rather than lined with composite materials. The air was drier, carrying the scent of old paper and preserved electronics. But it was the contents that really set this chamber apart. Where the main facility had been designed for aircraft maintenance and testing, this space was clearly meant for storage and documentation. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and long tables held stacks of documents that looked like they'd been hastily abandoned decades ago. "Dad, "Look at this," Sophie called from the far end of the chamber. She was standing next to what appeared to be a map table, the kind used for military planning. But instead of geographical features, this map showed flight patterns, test ranges, and what looked like crash sites scattered across the southwestern United States. Ray studied the markings, noting dates that spanned from 1947 to 1987. Some locations were marked in red with notations like recovered or secured. Others were marked in black with single words, lost. "It's not just about the stealth fighter," Sophie said, photographing the map with her phone. "This place was a hub for something much bigger. Look at these coordinates." She was pointing to a cluster of red marks in Nevada, each one labeled with a project name and date: Project Blue Book, Project Sign, Project Nightshade. Names that Ray vaguely recognized, but from conspiracy documentaries and late-night television shows about UFOs and government cover-ups. But Sophie was moving on to something even more interesting. A filing cabinet marked Nightshade Operational Logs. The lock had been cut recently, probably by whoever had been searching the facility before Ray bought it. Inside, they found flight records that painted a picture of intensive testing operations spanning nearly 4 decades. The F-121 Nightshade hadn't been a one-off prototype. It had been part of an ongoing program to develop aircraft based on technology that wasn't supposed to exist. "Dad, read this," Sophie said, handing him a file folder marked Incident Report, September 1987. The report detailed the disappearance of an F-121 during a routine test flight, along with its pilot and a ground support team of 3 technicians. According to the official record, the aircraft had suffered catastrophic systems failure and crashed in a remote area of the Nevada desert. Search and rescue operations had recovered only scattered debris. But handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. The crash had been staged to cover the theft of the aircraft by persons unknown. The pilot had been found alive but died under suspicious circumstances before he could be debriefed. The ground support team had simply vanished, their bodies never recovered. And at the bottom of the report, in Lena's unmistakable handwriting, E. Grange present during recovery operations. Questions re. Corporate involvement unanswered. "Mom was investigating the crash," Sophie said, reading over Ray's shoulder. She knew the official story was false. Ray kept reading, following the paper trail that led from that 1987 incident to a series of increasingly urgent memos about security breaches and unauthorized access to classified materials. The final document in the file was a resignation letter that Lena had apparently never submitted, a letter that accused Solaris Systems of stealing military technology and selling it to foreign governments. But it was the last page that really caught Ray's attention, a handwritten note dated just 3 days before Lena's death, hidden backup in secondary vault. "Insurance against corporate retaliation. R will know where to look." "She left us another message," Ray said, showing Sophie the note. "There's more evidence hidden somewhere in this facility." They spent the next hour searching for anything that might be considered a vault or a secure storage area. The facility was larger than they'd initially realized, with corridors branching off in multiple directions. Some led to storage rooms filled with aircraft parts and electronics. Others opened onto workshops equipped with tools and machinery for precision manufacturing. But it was Rusty who found the vault, scratching at what appeared to be a solid wall until Ray realized it was actually a hidden panel. Behind it was a small chamber containing a fireproof safe that had been left open, its contents scattered across the floor. Most of the documents had been taken, probably by whoever had been searching the facility before Ray's arrival. But they'd missed something. A small metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The kind of hiding place only someone who'd spent years working in this facility would have known about. Inside the box were photographs, technical specifications, and financial records that painted a clear picture of corporate espionage and murder. Solaris Systems hadn't just stolen classified technology. They'd systematically eliminated anyone who might expose their operations. And Ray Moreno had been their final target. "We have what Agent Kessler needs," Ray said, helping Sophie pack the documents into her backpack. "Evidence that can't be buried or classified away." But as they prepared to leave the underground facility, the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface made them both freeze. Multiple engines, moving fast, converging on the airfield from different directions. Ray switched off his flashlight and listened to the sound of car doors slamming, voices calling out orders, footsteps moving with military precision across the desert floor above their heads. "Sophie," he whispered, we're not alone anymore. Through the ventilation grates, they could hear someone shouting orders about sealing the perimeter and securing all access points. Professional voices, coordinated movements, the kind of operation that came with serious backing and official authority. Ray looked at his daughter, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. They had the evidence they needed to expose the truth about Lena's death and the conspiracy that had killed her. But first, they had to survive long enough to get it to someone who could use it. The hunt was on, and they were trapped underground with nowhere to run. The voices above grew more organized as Ray and Sophie huddled in the underground vault, listening to what sounded like a military-style operation unfolding on the surface. Through the ventilation system, they could hear radio chatter, the systematic search of the hangars, and the unmistakable sound of heavy equipment being moved into position. "Control, this is Team Alpha. Surface structures are clear. No sign of civilian presence, but we've got fresh tire tracks and evidence of recent excavation near Hangar 2. Ray recognized the voice, one of the men from Grange's security team who'd been watching his house for the past week. This wasn't a federal operation. It was a corporate cleanup, the kind of private military contractor work that happened in legal gray areas where accountability was optional. Sophie was already moving toward the far end of the vault, where a narrow maintenance tunnel disappeared into darkness. "Dad, there's got to be another way out. These facilities always have emergency exits." She was right. Ray had worked on enough government installations to know that paranoid engineers always built multiple escape routes. The question was whether they could find one before Grange's people discovered the underground facility. They crawled through the maintenance tunnel for what felt like hours, following electrical conduits and water lines through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. The air was stale and hot, and Ray found himself fighting claustrophobia as the walls pressed in around them. But Sophie's instincts proved correct. The tunnel eventually opened into what appeared to be a natural cave system, complete with a hidden exit that emerged behind a rocky outcrop about a quarter mile from the main hangars. They could see the search operation from their concealed position. 24 men in tactical gear, 3 black SUVs, and a mobile communications unit that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "We need to get to town," Ray said, checking his phone and finding no signal. "Find Sheriff Martinez and Agent Kessler." But as they prepared to make their way across the desert on foot, Ray's phone buzzed with an incoming text message that somehow reached them despite the lack of cell towers in the area. Someone was using military-grade communications equipment to reach him. The message was simple and terrifying. "We have your friend. Stop running, or the old man dies." Attached was a photo of Hank Dalton, tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, blood running from a cut on his forehead, his eyes defiant despite obvious pain. "They took Hank," Ray said, showing Sophie the photo. "This is my fault. He tried to help us, and now—" "Dad, stop!" Sophie's voice cut through his guilt with the sharp precision she'd inherited from her mother. "This isn't your fault. These people killed Mom and 7 other engineers. They were always going to hurt anyone who got in their way." Ray looked at his 16-year-old daughter and saw the kind of steel that had made Lena willing to stand up to corporate killers. Sophie was right. This had stopped being about them personally the moment they discovered the underground facility. Now it was about justice, truth, and making sure that Lena's death hadn't been meaningless. "We're not running," he said finally. "We're going on the offensive." The plan that Sophie outlined as they hiked across the desert toward town was both brilliant and completely insane. Instead of hiding from Grange and his mercenaries, they would use the evidence they'd gathered to force a public confrontation. But first, they needed allies. Mayor Jocelyn Briggs was not the person Ray would have chosen for a conspiracy against corporate killers. The woman who ran Kendall Falls was more comfortable with budget meetings and ribbon cuttings than high-stakes espionage. But when Ray and Sophie showed up at her office with a backpack full of classified documents and a story about murder and cover-ups, something unexpected happened. Briggs got angry. "You're telling me that these corporate bastards killed Ray Moreno and 6 other people, and now they're threatening to kill Hank Dalton?" The mayor's usually perfect hair was disheveled from running her hands through it, and her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fury in her eyes. "In my town?" "It's bigger than just our town," Sophie said, spreading the financial records across Briggs' desk. "Solaris Systems has contracts with defense departments in 12 different countries. They're selling stolen American military technology to anyone with enough money. And they think they could intimidate us into keeping quiet. Briggs stood up and began pacing behind her desk. Well, they picked the wrong town and the wrong mayor. Ray watched in amazement as the woman he'd always considered a small-time politician transformed into something resembling a general preparing for war. Briggs started making phone calls to the state attorney general's office, to investigative reporters at major newspapers, to federal agencies that had oversight authority over defense contractors. "Jocelyn, what are you doing?" Ray asked as she hung up from her 5th call in 10 minutes. "I'm making this story too big to bury," she said, already dialing another number. "By tomorrow morning, half the federal government is going to be asking questions about Solaris systems and their operations at your airfield. Let's see how tough Grange feels when he's dealing with Senate oversight committees and criminal investigators." But even as Briggs worked her political connections, Ray knew they were running out of time. Hank was still a prisoner, and Grange's people were still searching the airfield. They needed immediate action, not bureaucratic solutions. That's when Agent Kessler arrived. She walked into the mayor's office looking like she'd been awake for 3 straight days, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by the rumpled desperation of someone whose carefully organized world had just exploded. "Mr. Moreno," she said, "we need to talk. Privately." Ray followed her into the hallway, leaving Sophie to continue documenting evidence with Mayor Briggs. "My superiors have ordered me to stand down," Kessler said without preamble. "Apparently, Solaris Systems has friends in Washington who outrank my friends. I've been officially reassigned to a desk job investigating procurement irregularities in the Pacific Northwest. So you're here to warn us off?" Kessler smiled, the first genuine expression Ray had seen from her. "Actually, I'm here to tell you that I've taken a leave of absence for personal reasons, which means that whatever I do in the next few days is as a private citizen, not as a federal agent." Ray studied her face, looking for the catch. "Why would you risk your career for us?" "Because I joined the Department of Defense to protect this country, not to cover up for corporate thieves who get people killed." Kessler pulled out her phone and showed him a series of text messages. "I've been in contact with other agents who share my concerns. We can't move officially, but we can provide support and expertise to local law enforcement." "We don't have any local law enforcement," Ray pointed out. "Sheriff Martinez covers 3 counties with 6 deputies. Then we'll have to improvise." Ray looked back through the office window at his daughter and the mayor, both bent over laptops and documents, working with the focused intensity of people who'd found a cause worth fighting for. For the first time since buying the airfield, he felt like they might actually have a chance. But as he turned back to Agent Kessler, his phone buzzed with another message from Grange's people. This one contained no words, just a photo of the underground hangar where the F-121 Nightshade sat hidden beneath its protective tarps. They'd found the aircraft. "We're out of time," Ray said, showing Kessler the photo. "They've got the plane, they've got Hank, and they probably think they've got us cornered." "Then it's time to show them how wrong they are," Kessler replied. "I've got some equipment in my car that might level the playing field." Ray thought about his wife's voice on that digital recorder, talking about technology that was too advanced to exist, too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. Lena had died trying to prevent exactly this scenario. Corporate thieves stealing classified military assets and selling them for profit. But she'd also left behind a daughter who was brilliant enough to understand the technology and brave enough to fight for the truth, and a husband who was finally ready to finish what she'd started. "What do you need from us?" Ray asked. Kessler's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "Just point me toward the people who killed your wife. I'll handle the rest." The plan that emerged from their impromptu war council was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. While Grange's mercenaries were focused on securing the underground facility and the stealth aircraft, Ray and his allies would use the distraction to rescue Hank and expose the entire conspiracy to the world. Agent Kessler had brought more than just moral support. The equipment in her government sedan included surveillance gear, communications intercepts, and what she diplomatically called non-lethal deterrent devices. Sophie took one look at the array of high-tech gadgets and declared it better than Christmas. "The good news," Kessler explained as they huddled around a map of the airfield, "is that Grange is operating outside any official authority. His people are private contractors, which means they have to be careful about using excessive force where it might be witnessed." "And the bad news?" Ray asked. The bad news is that they've got superior numbers, better equipment, and no qualms about eliminating witnesses if they think they can do it quietly. Mayor Briggs had spent the afternoon making more phone calls, and the results were starting to show. 2 investigative reporters were driving down from Las Vegas. A federal prosecutor was asking uncomfortable questions about Solaris systems, government contracts, and someone at the Pentagon was demanding to know why classified aircraft were apparently sitting in civilian hands. But none of that would help Hank Dalton if Grange decided to cut his losses and eliminate the evidence, including the witnesses. "We need to move tonight," Ray said, studying the photos Sophie had taken of Grange's operation, "before they can relocate the aircraft or—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Before they killed Hank and disappeared with their stolen technology. Sophie had been quiet during most of the planning session, working on her laptop with the intense focus she brought to complex physics problems. Now she looked up with the expression she got when she'd solved an equation that had been bothering her. "Dad, I think I know how to wake up the nightshade." She turned her laptop around to show them a series of technical diagrams she'd reconstructed from the fragmented files they'd found in the underground vault. Mom didn't just design the stealth systems. She created a back door, a way to remotely activate the aircraft's basic systems in case of emergency. Ray studied the diagrams, recognizing some of the components from his years as an aviation mechanic. "You're talking about actually powering up a military aircraft?" "Just the communications, navigation, and defensive systems, enough to broadcast the aircraft's existence to every radar installation in the southwestern United States." Sophie's eyes were bright with excitement and fear. "If we can get the plane to announce itself, Grange won't be able to hide what he's stolen." Agent Kessler leaned forward, studying the technical specifications. "This is insane. You're talking about activating classified military technology without authorization. Even if it works, even if it exposes Grange, we could all end up in federal prison." "Better than ending up dead in the desert," Ray replied. "And if we don't try, Hank definitely won't survive the night." Mayor Briggs had been making notes during their discussion, filling a legal pad with the kind of detailed planning that had made her successful in local politics. Now she looked up with the determined expression of someone who decided to bet everything on a single hand. "I can give you 2 hours," she said. 2 hours before I have to call in state and federal authorities officially. That should be enough time to either rescue Hank and expose the conspiracy, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Ray checked his watch. It was already past 9 p.m., and the desert night was settling over Kendall Falls like a black blanket studded with stars. In 2 hours, one way or another, this would be over. They approached the airfield from the east, using the rocky terrain to mask their approach from the surveillance equipment Grange's people had deployed around the perimeter. Kessler moved with the practiced stealth of someone trained in covert operations, while Sophie navigated by GPS and natural landmarks with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in the desert. Ray carried the mobile communications unit they'd need to access the aircraft systems, along with a growing certainty that he was leading his daughter into a situation that could get them both killed. The underground facility was lit up like a research laboratory, with portable generators providing power for floodlights and electronic equipment. Through the periscope Kessler had provided, Ray could see at least a dozen men working around the F-121 Nightshade, photographing it from every angle, and apparently preparing to dismantle key components for transport. "They're stripping it," he whispered to Sophie, "taking the most valuable parts and leaving the rest." "Not if we activate it first," she replied, setting up her laptop and connecting it to the communications array. "Mom's back doors should still work, assuming they haven't changed the aircraft's core systems." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Ray's life. Sophie worked with quiet intensity, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she navigated through layers of encrypted security protocols. Agent Kessler monitored radio communications from Grange's people, providing updates on their activities and alerting them to any changes in the security perimeter. And Ray watched the men dismantling his wife's greatest achievement, stealing the technology she'd died trying to protect. "I'm in," Sophie whispered finally. "Dad, I can see the aircraft status displays. Everything's functional. Power plant, avionics, even the defensive systems. It's like Mom left it ready for someone to find." "Can you activate the communications systems without alerting them?" "Already doing it." Sophie's laptop screen filled with data streams and system diagnostics. "The aircraft is coming online now. In about 30 seconds. Every military radar installation from Colorado to California is going to detect a stealth fighter that's not supposed to exist. Ray watched through the periscope as lights began flickering across the F-121's instrument panels. The men working around it stepped back in confusion, then alarm, as the aircraft's systems activated without any external power source or human intervention. That's when the underground hangar filled with the sound of alarms. "Multiple radar contacts, sir." Someone was shouting over the communication system. "Nellis Air Force Base is lighting us up, demanding identification. Peterson Space Force Base is scrambling interceptors." Granger's voice crackled over the radio, tight with barely controlled rage. "Shut it down! Cut all power to the aircraft!" But it was too late. The F-121 Nightshade was fully awake now, its stealth systems cycling through startup sequences, its communication arrays broadcasting identification codes that hadn't been used in over 30 years. The aircraft that was supposed to be a classified secret was announcing its existence to the world. "Sophie, we need to go," Ray said, starting to pack up their equipment. "They're going to figure out what we did." But his daughter was staring at her laptop screen, watching data streams that seemed to fascinate and terrify her in equal measure. "Dad, the aircraft isn't just broadcasting its location, it's uploading everything. Flight logs, technical specifications, operational records. Mom programmed it to dump all its classified data if it was ever activated without proper authorization." Through the periscope, Ray could see Grange's people running for their vehicles, abandoning their operation as military aircraft began appearing on the horizon. The corporate theft was over, exposed by the very technology they'd tried to steal. But as they prepared to leave their observation post, Agent Kessler's radio crackled with a transmission that made Ray's blood freeze. "This is Team Bravo. We have the old man secured at the secondary location, awaiting orders." Hank was still a prisoner, still in danger from people who no longer had anything to lose. Ray looked at his daughter, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. The stealth fighter was safe, the conspiracy was exposed, but their friend was still in the hands of killers. "Sophie, I need you to go back to town. Find Sheriff Martinez and—" "No," she said firmly. "We finished this together. Mom would have finished it." Ray thought about arguing about the dangers of taking a 16-year-old into a rescue operation against armed professionals. But Sophie was right. Lena would have finished it, would have made sure that everyone who'd been put in danger was brought home safely. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this smart, and if I tell you to run, you run." Agent Kessler was already moving toward the secondary location Grange's people had mentioned, her equipment pack slung over her shoulder, and her expression set in the grim lines of someone preparing for a fight. Ray followed, with Sophie beside him and the distant sound of military helicopters growing louder in the desert night. Whatever happened next, Lena's truth was finally free. Now they just had to survive long enough to see justice done. The warehouse where they were holding Hank sat on the outskirts of Kendall Falls, a relic from the town's brief prosperity during the mining boom of the 1970s. Now it squatted in the desert, like a forgotten monument to economic failure, its corrugated walls scarred by wind and sand, its windows long since boarded over. Ray approached the building with Agent Kessler, while Sophie maintained overwatch from a position behind an abandoned pickup truck, monitoring communications and ready to call for backup if things went wrong. The sounds of military aircraft filled the night sky as search teams from 3 different air bases converged on the airfield, but out here at the warehouse, the silence was broken only by the whisper of desert wind. 2 guards at the front entrance, 1 at the back. Kessler reported after completing a reconnaissance circuit of the building. "Grange's people are getting sloppy, probably rattled by what happened at the airfield." Ray checked the non-lethal deterrent device Kessler had given him, a high-tech taser that looked like something from a science fiction movie. He'd never considered himself capable of violence, but the thought of Hank Dalton suffering because of his choices had awakened something protective and dangerous in his chest. "Remember," Kessler whispered as they prepared to move, "these aren't government agents anymore. They're criminals who've been caught red-handed. That makes them desperate, but it also means we don't have to worry about jurisdiction or rules of engagement." The rescue operation was over, almost before it began. Kessler moved with the fluid efficiency of someone trained for this kind of work, neutralizing the guards with swift, silent professionalism. Ray followed her into the warehouse, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. They found Hank in a makeshift holding area constructed from shipping containers and chain-link fencing. The old veteran was conscious but battered, his face swollen from interrogation that had obviously turned physical. But his eyes were alert and angry, and he managed a grim smile when he saw Ray approaching. "About time," Hank said as Ray cut his restraints. "I was starting to think you'd decided to leave me to these corporate bastards." "Never," Ray replied, helping his friend to his feet. "Can you walk?" "Can I walk? Son, I could dance if it meant getting out of here." But as they prepared to leave the warehouse, the sound of approaching vehicles made them all freeze. Multiple engines, moving fast, converging on their location from different directions. "Backup plan," Kessler said, pulling out her phone. "We call in the cavalry." What arrived wasn't cavalry in the traditional sense. Sheriff Martinez showed up first, his single patrol car followed by Mayor Briggs in her official vehicle, its emergency flashers painting the desert in red and blue. Behind them came a caravan that looked like something from a disaster movie. Federal agents, state investigators, military police, and enough media personnel to staff a small television station. Ray watched from the warehouse doorway as his quiet desert town transformed into the center of a major federal investigation. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights turning night into day. Mobile command units were establishing communications with Washington, Nevada, and probably half a dozen other locations where important people were trying to figure out how a stolen stealth fighter had ended up broadcasting classified information to the world. "Mr. Moreno," a voice called from the controlled chaos. Ray turned to see a man in a federal marshal's uniform approaching, flanked by two agents in the kind of suits that screamed, "Serious government business." "Yes?" "Marshal Jim Thompson, Federal Witness Protection Service. We need to talk." The conversation that followed was surreal in its implications. According to Marshal Thompson, the activation of the F-121 Nightshade had triggered a cascade of revelations that reached all the way to Washington. Solaris Systems was under federal investigation for treason, corporate espionage, and multiple counts of murder. Elliot Grange was in custody, along with most of his mercenaries. And Ray Moreno, small-town mechanic, had somehow become a key witness in what the media was already calling, quote, "the largest defense contractor scandal in American history." "The good news," Thompson explained, "is that you're heroes. The president is going to want to meet you personally. The bad news is that there are a lot of very powerful people who would prefer that this story never came to light." Ray looked around at the circus that had taken over his quiet corner of Nevada. Television crews were setting up satellite uplinks, federal agents were processing evidence, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the distinctive whine of military transports preparing to secure the underground facility. "What happens to the aircraft?" Sophie asked, joining the conversation with the directness that had become her trademark. Marshal Thompson smiled. "According to the preliminary briefing I received, the F-121 Nightshade is going to become the centerpiece of a new museum dedicated to aerospace innovation and the courage of whistleblowers. The Lena Moreno Center for Aviation Legacy, if I understand correctly." Ray felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. His wife's name would be honored, her sacrifice recognized, her work celebrated instead of buried in classified files. "And us?" he asked. "You get to go home," Thompson replied, "with full federal protection and a considerable compensation package for your cooperation in exposing this conspiracy. Plus, there's apparently some kind of congressional medal in your future." But it was Agent Kessler who provided the most satisfying update. Elliot Grange and his associates are facing federal charges that carry mandatory life sentences. The evidence you gathered, combined with what we recovered from Solaris Systems, computers, has given us enough to dismantle their entire operation. Ray found himself thinking about Lena's voice on that digital recorder, talking about technology that was too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. She'd been right, as usual, but she'd also been right about something else. Sometimes the people you love find ways to finish what you started, even when you're not there to guide them. "Dad," Sophie said, taking his hand, "Mom would be proud." Ray looked at his daughter. Brilliant, brave, too young to have dealt with murder and conspiracy but strong enough to see it through to the end. In her eyes he saw traces of Lena's determination and intelligence, but also something new. Sophie had found her own courage, her own sense of purpose. "Yes," he said finally, "she would be." As the federal investigators continued their work around them, Ray and Sophie walked back toward town, leaving the circus of official business behind. Tomorrow there would be interviews, depositions, and probably more media attention than a small desert community could handle. But tonight there was just a father and daughter walking home under a sky full of stars, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the truth is worth fighting for, even when it seems impossible to win. Especially when it seems impossible to win. The lights of Kendall Falls spread out before them, a small constellation of human habitation in the vast darkness of the Nevada desert. It wasn't much to look at, this town that had forgotten how to dream, but it had produced a woman brave enough to stand up to corporate killers, and it had given shelter to the family that finished what she started. Ray thought that was worth celebrating. 6 months later, Ray Moreno stood in the doorway of what had once been an abandoned hangar, watching a group of fourth graders from Las Vegas discover the magic of flight. The Ray Moreno Center for Aviation Legacy had officially opened 3 weeks ago, but every day still brought new visitors, school groups, aerospace engineers, retired military pilots, and conspiracy theorists who couldn't quite believe that the truth had finally come to light. The F-121 Nightshade sat in the center of the restored hangar like a dark angel, its angular surfaces absorbing and scattering light in ways that still seemed impossible to Ray's mechanic's eye. A bronze plaque near the aircraft's nose bore Lena's photograph and a simple inscription: Dr. Helena M. Hawthorne Moreno, 1962 to 1987. Engineer, innovator, truth-teller. Mr. Moreno? A small voice interrupted his thoughts. Ray looked down to see a girl who couldn't have been more than 9 years old, wearing a NASA t-shirt and clutching a notebook filled with carefully drawn diagrams of aircraft. Yes? Is it true that your wife really designed this whole airplane by herself? Ray smiled, the same expression he'd worn through dozens of similar conversations over the past few months. She had help from a lot of very smart people. But yes, your mom was the lead engineer. She figured out how to make it invisible to radar. Cool, the girl said, making notes in her book. I want to design airplanes too. My teacher says girls can be engineers now. Girls have always been engineers, Ray replied. Sometimes they just had to work harder to prove it. The girl nodded seriously and ran back to her group, already explaining to her classmates what she'd learned about stealth technology and the woman who'd helped perfect it. Ray watched her go, thinking about the conversation he'd had with Sophie that morning. His daughter was leaving for MIT in 3 days, armed with a full scholarship from the Department of Defense and a letter of recommendation from the president himself. She'd chosen aerospace engineering, naturally, with a specialty in advanced propulsion systems. Following in Mom's footsteps, she'd said when the acceptance letter arrived, but hopefully with better security arrangements. The museum had become more than Ray had ever imagined when he'd impulsively bid on 150 acres of desert wasteland. What started as a monument to his wife's sacrifice had grown into a center for aerospace education, a tourist destination that was putting Kendall Falls back on the map, and a symbol of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to let the truth stay buried. Mayor Briggs had been elected to the state legislature on a platform of government transparency and corporate accountability. Agent Kessler had been promoted to head a new task force investigating defense contractor fraud. Hank Dalton had become the museum's unofficial historian, regaling visitors with stories about the secret aircraft that had flown over Nevada's desert for decades. And Elliot Grange, the former CEO of Solaris Systems, was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in a federal supermax prison, along with most of his conspirators. The corporate empire he'd built on stolen technology and murder had collapsed overnight, its assets seized by the government and its remaining employees scattered to legitimate defense contractors who actually respected the law. "Dad, the afternoon tour group is here," Sophie called from the museum's entrance. She'd spent the summer working as a tour guide, sharing her mother's story with visitors from around the world. Tomorrow she'd drive north to college, but today she was still his partner in this unlikely venture. Ray joined her at the front desk, where a group of about 20 adults waited with the eager anticipation of people about to see something extraordinary. Among them, Ray recognized a familiar face, Drive Sarah Chen, an aerospace engineer from Boeing who'd made the trip from Seattle specifically to see Lena's work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ray began, falling into the routine he'd developed over months of practice. "Welcome to the Ray Moreno Center for Aviation Legacy. What you're about to see is the F-121 Nightshade, the most advanced stealth aircraft ever built, designed by a brilliant engineer who gave her life to prevent this technology from falling into the wrong hands." He led the group into the main hangar, watching their faces as they caught their first glimpse of the aircraft. Even in daylight, filtered through the hangar's skylights, the nightshade seemed to absorb and redirect light in ways that made it difficult to focus on. The stealth technology that had made it invisible to radar also played tricks with human vision. The aircraft was hidden beneath this facility for over 30 years, Ray continued, part of a classified program that officially never existed. Dr. Moreno discovered that her work was being stolen by corporate interests who planned to sell it to foreign governments. When she tried to expose the conspiracy, she was murdered, along with 6 other engineers who knew too much. Dr. Chen raised her hand. How did you manage to prove the conspiracy? Corporate espionage cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Sophie stepped forward, the movement so natural that Ray realized she'd grown comfortable in her role as co-curator of her mother's legacy. Mom left us a roadmap, Sophie explained. Hidden files, backup recordings, and most importantly, a remote activation sequence that allowed the aircraft to broadcast its existence to the world when corporate thieves tried to steal it. She knew that sometimes the best way to protect a secret is to make it public. The tour continued for another hour, covering the technical specifications of the aircraft, the history of the stealth program, and the investigation that had ultimately brought down Solaris Systems. Ray found himself watching Sophie as she answered questions with the confidence and precision that had made her mother such a formidable engineer. But it was the final stop on the tour that always affected him most deeply. At the end of the hangar, separated from the main display by a wall of glass, was Lena's recreated workstation. Her original desk, her technical manuals, her family photographs, and the digital recorder that had started their journey toward the truth. This is where it all began, Ray said, placing his hand on the glass, where a brilliant woman made the decision to put truth and justice ahead of personal safety. Her courage saved American military technology from being sold to the highest bidder, and it saved her family from never knowing why she died. After the tour group departed, Ray and Sophie sat in the museum's small cafe, sharing coffee and watching the sun begin to set over the Nevada desert. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, new opportunities to share Lena's story with people who needed to hear it. Dad, Sophie said quietly, do you think Mom would be happy with what we've built here? Ray looked around the transformed hangar, at the displays showcasing aerospace innovation and the courage of whistleblowers, at the photographs of his wife, surrounded by tributes from engineers and pilots around the world. I think she'd be amazed, he said finally. Your mom always said that the best engineers are the ones who solve problems other people didn't even know existed. We've solved the problem of her story being forgotten. Sophie smiled, the expression so reminiscent of her mother that Ray felt his chest tighten with remembered love and loss. And we've shown people that sometimes the craziest decisions turn out to be the right ones, she added. Who would have thought that spending my college fund on an abandoned airport would lead to all this? Ray laughed, thinking back to that morning at the county auction when grief and intuition had combined to make him bid on 150 acres of worthless desert. It had seemed like the desperate act of a man who'd lost his way. Instead, it had been the beginning of finding his way back to purpose. Sometimes, he said, the best discoveries happen when you're not looking for them. As the last light of day painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, Ray walked his daughter to her car. In 3 days, she'd leave for college, beginning her own journey as an aerospace engineer. But tonight, they had one more evening together in the place where impossible things had turned out to be true. The F-121 Nightshade sat in its climate-controlled hangar, no longer hidden but celebrated, its secrets transformed from classified weapons data into educational inspiration. Above it, a banner displayed the motto Sophie had chosen for the museum, Truth Takes Flight. Ray thought Lena would have approved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.